Can legal memory replace official documents? Have you ever thought that one person's silence could echo louder than 100 eloquent speeches? That in a room full of power and prejudice, the most underestimated person could be the only one carrying the truth? This story begins in a place where justice seems reserved only for those who dress properly and speak beautifully. But one man, with calloused hands and a quiet gaze, stepped into that room bringing with him mud, wisdom, and a reminder to the system: never underestimate someone just because they don't shout. Courtroom 3 of the Santa Lorenza district was a small, dilapidated room. Its walls stained by moisture, ceiling marked by dark leaks, the air thick with the smell of old paper and indifference. People often compared it to a forgotten district office, where justice was just a plaque hanging on the door. That morning, everything was as quiet as any other day until the wooden door creaked open, and a man walked in. He entered without haste, but not with caution either, as if stepping into a place he once knew, not into a room that would decide his fate. His pale shirt was wrinkled, sleeves rolled past the elbows. His khaki pants were old, stained with dry mud, and his leather shoes were cracked from years of wear. In his left hand, a faded wide-brimmed hat. In his right, a bundle of documents tied with a rubber band, the pages worn and curled from being opened too many times. He nodded slightly. "Good morning." No one responded. Only a young clerk in an oversized suit looked up from his phone screen and frowned when he saw him. The clerk typed something perfunctorily, then asked in a flat voice, "Your name?" "Pedro Vargas." "I'm from Los Malls Farm." "Legal representative?" "None." "I'm representing myself." The clerk's lips curled into a half-smile, the kind worn by those given a sliver of authority and using it to sneer at those who don't know how to dress the part. "Brave," he muttered, then turned back to his screen as if no one stood before him. Pedro didn't react. He walked straight to the back row of the courtroom where it was cleaner from lack of use and sat down. Placing the folder on his lap, he leaned back, eyes fixed on the undefined space ahead. But anyone observant could tell he was watching every detail, every glance, every whispered word from strangers sneaking peeks at him. "You see? That's the crazy old farmer. Word is, he reads newspapers like some kind of intellectual." Pedro heard it all but didn't turn around. He was used to it. Used to being looked down on for walking in from the mud into a world of marble floors and legal jargon. At 9:31 a.m., the back door opened. A tall man dressed in black with a tie and a robe flowing from his shoulders entered. Judge Gabriel Ramirez, well-groomed, slicked back hair, a gleaming gold watch, walked in like he was the host of a theater, not a trial. He scanned the room without pause. "Good morning." No one answered. It was just a ritual. "We begin hearing case 3127B, the suit between Pedro Vargas and the Santa Lorenza government. Concerning illegal occupation of public land," he said without looking at anyone in particular. The plaintiff's attorney stood up, fitted suit, gelled hair, the confident smile of a man who wins trials not through truth but through charm. "Barrio Nuevo, representing the local authorities." The judge nodded. "Defendant?" Pedro stood. "Present, Your Honor." "Where is your lawyer?" "I have none. I'm representing myself." A strange silence passed. Then, a few quiet laughs from the back. Pedro remained unfazed. Judge Ramirez looked at him through his glasses, eyes filled with suspicion and fatigue. "You understand what you're being accused of?" "Yes," Pedro replied. "I'm being charged with illegally occupying land, unauthorized construction, altering a water stream, and ignoring official government notices." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. Well, at least you read the file. Pedro gave a small nod, then looked up with steady eyes. I didn't come to win. I came to speak the truth. No one spoke. But in that courtroom, that sentence marked the start of a battle no one saw coming. And the man they mocked, the one with muddy shoes and a slow voice, was the only one patient enough to wield silence as a weapon. Have you ever seen someone lose not because they were wrong, but because they didn't look polished enough to be heard? Not because their words lacked logic, but because their voice wasn't smooth enough to make power comfortable? In that courtroom, when Pedro Vargas sat down holding a hand-drawn map in a worn folder, the outcome was already assumed. No one expected him to say anything of value. They just waited for him to confirm what they'd already decided, that he was a stubborn countryman, occupying land, ignorant of the law, pretending to delay the inevitable. Attorney Barrio Nuevo began his presentation with the smooth, slick demeanor of someone who had won more through performance than principle. He showed satellite maps, administrative orders, land inspection reports. Each image, each document was choreographed to frame Pedro as a disruptor of the system. He described Pedro as a man who occupied public land without registration, without construction permits, who altered natural water streams, and ignored at least 5 official government notices. His expression was filled with disdain. Each word was not only an attack on Pedro but a statement to the judge and the room that he was the only qualified person there. Pedro remained still. No frown, no retort. Only a tightening of his grip on the rim of his hat. One reaction born from restraint, not rage. And Your Honor, Barrio Nuevo concluded, this man hasn't just broken the law, he is unfit to manage public land. He lacks technical education, has no engineering background, no formal training. He is a man of instinct and feeling, not suitable for the standards of a modern society. Judge Ramirez nodded slowly. Thank you. Defendant, anything you wish to say? Pedro rose, quietly opened his folder, took out a crude hand-drawn diagram and a few neatly written notes. He walked up and handed them to the clerk, then returned to his seat. Ramirez glanced at the drawing. What is this? A preschool map? He asked, half smiling, half mocking. The courtroom laughed. Not loudly but sharp enough to cut. Pedro didn't respond. His eyes didn't lower, nor did he retaliate. He simply said, this is how I show what I know, what I've done, and what I'm trying to protect. Ramirez tapped his fingers on the desk. What laws do you even know? Do you know what the Civil Code says about land occupation? Yes, Your Honor. Since when? Pedro met his eyes not with defiance or anger. Just truth. Since before you had your first gray hair. The courtroom stirred. Someone gasped. But Pedro didn't say it to insult, he spoke with memory, with the silence of someone who read the law not to win a case, but to understand why the one he loved died without protection. Ramirez clenched his fist. He couldn't argue. Not because Pedro was wrong but because he had just been reminded that knowledge doesn't come in a fixed form. It doesn't have to wear a suit or come with embossed folders. Sometimes, it's in a trembling hand-drawn sketch, in an unwavering gaze, in a man who doesn't shout but silences a room. This hearing is adjourned. A ruling will be issued in 3 weeks. Ramirez declared, then lowered his head to gather his papers, avoiding the gaze of the man who had just disarmed him. Pedro bowed his head slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. I don't need luck. I need justice. And I still remember where to find it. He left the room the way he came in, silence, with purpose. But this time, Behind him was a question hanging in the air: did we just misjudge him? No one answered. But this silence this time had begun to lean Pedro's way. Some wounds don't bleed, but cut deep into the soul. Some trials don't deliver death sentences, but kill a person's belief in justice. That day, Pedro Vargas didn't walk out looking like a defeated man, but like someone finally awakened from a decades-long sleep. The road back to Los Males that afternoon was lined with red dust. On his old bicycle, he pedaled slowly past dry fields that needed rain as badly as he needed an answer. The wind howled, stirring up old thoughts once buried in the mossy corners of his memory. When he got home, Pedro carefully placed the file on the table. He didn't eat, didn't speak to anyone. He stood for a long time in front of the wooden cabinet by the wall where he had locked away everything life had forced him to give up. Eventually, he opened it. From the deepest drawer, he pulled out a weathered wooden box with a loose latch. The smell of old dust mixed with the chirping of crickets outside. Inside was a buried youth, a thick notebook labeled Pedro Vargas, Law, 1986. A warped student ID from the National University, still readable, honor student, full scholarship. An old photo of him, young face, eyes full of ambition, standing next to a radiant girl with long hair, Clara. Clara, that name still hit Pedro's heart every time he remembered. The girl who once sat with him under the tree outside the library, dreaming of a wooden house and children playing in a field. They had everything: faith, intellect, and real love. Until one day, Clara fell ill. A fever, a wrong diagnosis, and a string of cold hospital days. Pedro ran everywhere writing petitions, calling lawyers, consulting doctors, reading medical books. But no one listened to a poor student with no connections. No one cared about a desperate voice with nothing to offer but sincerity. Eventually, Pedro dropped out. He brought Clara back to Los Males, where they once dreamed of home. But there wasn't enough time. Clara died one winter morning, leaving behind an empty house, a broken dream, and a question that haunted Pedro for 30 years. What's the point of law if it can't arrive when it's needed most? From that moment, Pedro locked it all away: documents, textbooks, awards. He buried the intellectual within and became a farmer in every sense. He grew vegetables, raised cattle, repaired wells, helped villagers fix school roofs when storms hit. No one knew he had once been the best student of his class. No one remembered the man who once read the civil code like it was poetry. And Pedro didn't need them to. Until today. Pedro sat down. He opened each old page: class notes on administrative procedure, land law, constitutional rights. His fingers traced the handwriting of his student years, clear, methodical, sometimes with colorful mind maps. His memory had never forgotten. It had only been asleep from sorrow. Now, it awakened from shame. And deep inside, a quiet fire lit, not for revenge, but to clarify what's right. That night, his son Tomasz saw him studying under the oil lamp, eyes focused like a new student. Tomasz sat beside him in silence. "What are you doing, Dad?" he asked softly. Pedro didn't look up. His voice was calm but firm. "I'm studying again." "Again? But Dad, you don't need to dash." Pedro finally raised his eyes. They weren't sad or angry but glowing with a light long buried, the return of belief. "Not again, Tomasz. This time it's real. I won't let them say I don't know anymore. I won't let them step on people like me just because we don't speak smoothly or dress fashionably. I'll speak in the one language they truly respect, law, so they'll finally hear what they've long avoided: the truth." That night, in his new notebook, the first after 30 years, Pedro wrote his first line. They laughed when I spoke in a farmer's voice. Next time, I'll answer in the language they bow to law. And that's when the real trial began. Not in the courtroom, but on the pages now being written by a heart once silenced by sorrow, and now ready to speak with its whole life. How can someone who seems to have already fallen rise again, not with fists, not with shouting, but with quiet persistence, like water wearing through stone? After that night, Pedro's kitchen no longer smelled of morning tea, but of old paper and ballpoint ink. He woke before the rooster crowed, lit the stove with firewood, brewed a strong pot of mate, and quietly sat down at his old wooden table. The glow of the oil lamp cast shadows on his face, not the face of a rustic old man, but that of a warrior preparing for battle. Only this battle was fought with words. On the table, dusty old law books were neatly lined up like soldiers, still holding the spirit of justice inside them. Pedro marked lines, cross-checked statutes, wrote margin notes, compared decrees, analyzed conflicts between clauses, and reconstructed the entire administrative process since the start of the case. No computer, no legal software, no printer, only a pen, a ruler, and a man who had never forgotten who he once was. Every line he wrote wasn't just a legal defense, it was a spade digging into the hardened soil of injustice long left untouched. He no longer studied to memorize, but to defend. Not to pass exams, but to right a wrong. That afternoon, while Pedro was still hunched over his papers, a motorcycle stopped in front of the house. A young man, hair tousled from his helmet, backpack on one shoulder, arms full of disorganized papers, stood hesitantly at the gate. Pedro stepped out from the back. "Who are you looking for?" he asked. My name's Nacho. I'm an intern at the court. I was there during your hearing." Pedro nodded, unsurprised. "What do you need?" Nacho looked at him, eyes nervous but sincere. "I don't understand. How did you know Article 235 of the Civil Code in that situation?" "I'm a final year law student, and even I had to go look it up afterward." Pedro was quiet for a moment, then gave a soft smile. "Because while you were studying to get grades, I studied to survive." The air went still. That sentence wasn't a jab, it was the raw truth of two worlds, one inside the classroom, and the other in real life, where people like Pedro had to master the law not to debate it, but to live without being stripped of what was rightfully theirs. After a while of quiet conversation over mate, Nacho carefully pulled out a crumpled photocopy. "I probably shouldn't show you this, but in the internal remarks section, the judge wrote." Pedro opened the page. One cold line. No legal foundation. Emotional argumentation, insufficient to challenge the logic of the conclusion. Pedro wasn't angry. He gave a quiet chuckle. "So they still sleep soundly, thinking I only have feelings, not analysis. Will you appeal?" Nacho asked, a little shaky. Pedro rested his hand on the stack of papers he was preparing. His voice dropped. "Last time, I came to defend myself. This time, I'll come to teach them something." After Nacho left, Pedro sat back down. In front of him was the unfinished appeal letter. He added the final line. "I request that the appellate hearing consider not only legal evidence, but also the omission of an undeniable factor, the historical use of this land across 3 generations of my family." Below it, he signed his name not as a farmer, but as someone who had once been a law student. Someone who never forgot how to wield a pen like a sword. The counterattack had begun. But no one knew. No drums. No fanfare. No spectacle. Just a man, a wooden table, and a growing file like a storm brewing deep beneath the ground. Have you ever seen an appeal not typed, not emailed, but still able to make an entire legal system tremble at its touch? While the town of Santa Lorenzo went about its usual business, late buses, breakfast shops opening late, the local radio replaying last week's tango in a quiet house on the outskirts, a man kept his back bent over pages, working like a classical scholar in the age of touch screens. Pedro Vargas, farmer, widower, father, and now, a man challenging the law with nothing but memory and grit. The appeal folder thickened by the day, not in page count, but in depth. Pedro didn't write to beg, didn't plead for mercy. He restructured the entire case with the mind of someone once formally trained. Every argument had a citation. Every citation had a legal basis. Every error by the plaintiff, from technical mapping mistakes to neglecting the land's historical context, was dissected not with hatred, but with the silent sharpness of someone long dismissed. Then, on a windy afternoon, he stood in front of the Santa Lorenzo courthouse mailbox. No one accompanied him. No reporters. No allies. Just him, and the thick envelope in his hands, marked Appeal of Pedro Vargas, Case No. 3127B. He dropped it into the mailbox like a farmer planting a seed. No applause. No witnesses. But he knew, as every farmer knows, a seed doesn't need noise to grow. It only needs to be planted deep enough. And patience. 3 days later, in the courthouse, a photocopy of Pedro's appeal quietly circulated among staff. One of them, a silver-haired veteran clerk, read it, took a deep breath, and scribbled a note. Coherent reasoning. Acknowledges historical land use. Recommend Judge Ramirez reviews thoroughly. And that's when the whispers began. Not about the content of the appeal, but about the man who wrote it. Old Vargas isn't just some fool. Word is, he used to study law. His handwritten file reads like a real attorney's. Maybe something happened that made him quit. The question became a ripple. And that ripple reached all the way to Judge Ramirez's office, the same judge who once scoffed at Pedro's hand-drawn map. When the appeal reached his desk, Ramirez sat quietly, his fingers brushing over the tidy, slightly slanted handwriting. No typos, no begging, just tightly reasoned arguments like steel beams. He read it 3 times. Each time, his brow furrowed more. Because it didn't resemble any appeal he had read in 2 decades on the bench. On the last page, Pedro had written, "I do not ask for special treatment. I only ask to be regarded as a citizen with intellect, not dismissed for muddy clothes as if I know nothing of the law. I will not raise my voice. I will present. And if my words are not heard by ears, they will echo through truth." Ramirez clenched his jaw. For the first time in years, he felt the back of his shirt dampen with sweat. Just then, the door opened. Nacho, the young intern who had met Pedro, stepped in, holding another folder. "Your Honor, we found an old land file from 1984. It lists Amador Vargas, Pedro's father." Ramirez looked up. Fell silent. The name Amador Vargas hit him like a stick across the brain. It had never appeared in the previous documents. Not once. And Ramirez knew this oversight meant Pedro's appeal wasn't just valid. It might set a precedent. A precedent strong enough to reshape future land trials. That evening, Pedro skipped dinner. He sat by the oil lamp, reading his appeal like a will. Tomasz entered and placed a glass of water on the table. "Dad, what if they still don't accept it?" Pedro didn't look at his son. His voice was steady, "Then I'll keep writing. Until my words make them lower their heads. I don't need pardon. I need to be understood." And in the small notebook beside him, he wrote that day's journal entry. "I am no longer a man defending himself. I am a man teaching them that silence also remembers. And that memory is something they cannot erase." What would you say if I told you the man the whole system underestimated was the only one who knew exactly how broken it really was? And if he decided to speak in their language, could anyone truly hear it without feeling stripped bare? Pedro Vargas was no longer an unknown name in the dusty corridors of the Santa Lorenza courthouse. His handwritten appeal, no lawyer, no software, had spread like a strange tale among those who once saw him as just a stubborn farmer. Officials said nothing publicly, but everyone knew, if they didn't find a way to silence Pedro, dozens, maybe hundreds of others would rise from the mud and reclaim what had been taken for generations, their dignity. That afternoon, while Pedro was researching land rights across 3 generations, someone knocked on his door. Not Nacho, not a neighbor, not a reporter. But a man in a gray shirt, with a soft but sharp voice. "Good afternoon, Mr. Vargas. I'm from the Agricultural Coordination Office. We'd like to help you settle this. No need for an appeal." Pedro paused, set his pen down. "Settle means what, exactly?" "It means you'll be granted a new plot, with full documentation. Possibly financial support for restarting your cultivation. In exchange," he asked, without blinking, "you'll withdraw your appeal. And agree not to file further complaints." Pedro was silent for a long moment. Then he stood, stepped close, and spoke with a voice like distant thunder. "I don't farm land. I farm justice. The land I stand on matters because it is the truth. If you think I'll trade that for a different plot on paper, then I'm sorry. You've clearly never known what it feels like to have Clara hold your hand and say, 'Live to do what's right.'" The man quietly left. That very afternoon, Pedro brought a stack of documents to the public library. He asked to use a reading desk tucked away in the back corner. There, he laid out his legal diagram of the case, timelines, missing and existing documents, government violations, legal precedents from neglected rural regions. Within 3 days, others joined him at the table, not just Pedro, but Nacho, a law intern named Clara, a recent law graduate, and even a retired civics teacher. Pedro didn't call anyone. But he made them stay. And then, the unexpected happened. A handwritten summary titled Pedro Vargas's Defense Framework began to circulate. Someone scanned it. It went online. A friend of Nacho's shared it on a national law student forum. The post was titled, "The Man Who Pretended to Be a Fool, and Gave a Closing Argument That Silenced the Whole System." In just 2 days, over 50,000 views. Thousands of comments. One person wrote, "He didn't need to shout to break down walls. He wrote and made the entire system crack from within." But Pedro didn't read any of those comments. He still woke up at 4 a.m., brewed his tea, and studied. Because he knew, what he was doing wasn't for fame, but to teach justice how to remember. That night, he wrote in his journal, "They still think I'm studying to reclaim a piece of land. But no. I'm rebuilding a story future generations will tell, so they never forget, that an old man once pretended to be a fool to make the so-called wise step down from their thrones." Can you imagine a man with no social media, no lawyer, no money causing an entire town to speak softer and listen more closely, just because he walked through the square holding a folder and a calm gaze? Pedro Vargas never called himself a hero. He was just a farmer who once loved, once lost, once lived as quietly as grass after rain. But sometimes, the ones who don't chase recognition are the very ones history chooses to anchor justice when it starts to slip. After his appeal went viral, Pedro unknowingly became a symbol. At the cafe on Main Street, people stopped talking about fertilizer prices and whispered instead about the old man who reads law like a judge. At the local elementary school meeting, a literature teacher encouraged students to research someone in the community who stood up for what's right. And on the town radio, the host read an excerpt from Pedro's letter that had been reposted online. "I didn't come here to be pitied. I came so that people like me would never again be dismissed." Meanwhile, Pedro lived as he always had, rising early, fixing the broken gate, planting a new bed of greens, and reading case files late into the night. No cameras. No speeches. Just him, his oil lamp, and one belief: truth doesn't need amplification, it just needs time. Until one day, something small but unexpected happened. Pedro received a package. No sender listed. Inside was an old lawyer's robe, neatly folded, and a handwritten note. "I was your classmate in 1990. When you disappeared, we thought you'd given up. But now I know you stepped back to gather strength. Wear this again, Pedro. Not to prove anything to anyone, but to remind them, knowledge never goes out of style. J.L." Pedro held the robe. A breeze rustled the curtains. He gently ran his hand over the worn fabric. What rose in him wasn't pride or nostalgia but a sense of return. Not to glory. To himself. From the kitchen doorway, Tomasz paused when he saw his father holding the black robe. "You're going to wear that?" he asked. Pedro smiled. "No. I'm going to hang it in the office." "For what?" "To remind the system that if it can still oppress the people with disregard, then the people can still resist with knowledge." That afternoon, Pedro walked to his field. The soil was still parched, but his steps seemed deeper, heavier, as if each one planted a seed of faith. And then, something else no one expected happened. A reporter from the provincial TV station showed up to see Pedro. No appointment, no camera crew. Just a young woman, holding a voice recorder, eyes lit with admiration. "Can I interview you?" she asked. "I want to share your story with the whole province." Pedro looked at her, not refusing, but not excited either. "My story isn't about me. It's about how the system forgot how to listen to those who don't speak its language. That's exactly why we need to tell it," she replied. Pedro looked out toward the land he was fighting for. He nodded softly. "Record if you must. But don't write about me as a hero. Write that I'm a result of a system that went too long without being questioned. If there was ever a trial that didn't need a gavel to ring an alarm through the halls of power, it was the one where Pedro Vargas took the witness stand, not with rage, but with the calm of someone who had once gone silent from injustice." That morning, the Santa Lorenza civil court didn't look like usual. A quiet line of people stood outside, no banners, no chants. Just intent eyes. Farmers in faded shirts, law students with notebooks, laborers with patient faces. They came because they'd heard, today, Pedro Vargas would cross-examine the government lawyer himself in a public review session. Inside the courtroom, unfamiliar faces were present: a few small-town journalists, a retired judge, and most notably, Judge Laura Begoria, assigned to preside in place of Ramirez. Known for her integrity and seriousness, Pedro arrived early. Same white shirt, gray trousers, worn brown shoes. In his hand, a blue folder, its edges faded from overuse. No introduction was needed, everyone knew this was the man the system had expected to silence swiftly. When the session began, Government Attorney Barrio Nuevo stood to present his case: survey maps, administrative decrees, the latest technical report. He ended with a familiar statement. The defendant lacks legal standing to occupy public land. His documentation is substandard. His arguments are emotional. We request the appeal be dismissed. Brief. Cold. Precise. Judge Begoria nodded, then turned to Pedro. Señor Vargas, do you have anything to present? Pedro stood. No papers. No files. Just memory and calm honed through 30 years of silence. Your Honor, I don't dispute the documents. I dispute the perspective. Because if we define land rights only by coordinates, then the entire history of this place becomes scrap paper. The room stirred. Pedro stepped forward. He placed a black and white photo on the evidence table, a 1989 image of his father, Amador Vargas, standing beside a boundary marker on the disputed land. Behind him stood a local official, a land surveyor, and a handwritten report with a faint stamp. Pedro's voice was low, but clear. This is evidence that my father was authorized by the local government at the time to rehabilitate this land when no one else would. He planted trees, built a home, dug a well, and taught me and others how to live from the land, not off it. Attorney Barrio Nuevo interrupted. Objection. This evidence is invalid under current regulations. Pedro didn't turn to him. He simply said a sentence that made the entire courtroom fall silent. The law cannot void the truth just because it's old. Judge Begoria sat upright. Continue, Mr. Vargas. Pedro nodded. He pulled out a photocopy of a 1991 land use map, clearly showing the disputed plot marked as temporarily authorized for conditional management. He pointed to the faded line. Name, Amador Vargas. Valid. Never revoked. No termination order from any agency in over 30 years. A court clerk wiped sweat from his brow. The lawyer flipped through documents frantically. In the gallery, Nacho clutched his folder, nearly standing to applaud. Pedro wasn't done. No cancellation letter was ever sent. Yet they accuse me of land grabbing. If this is land grabbing, then my crime is inheriting my father's responsibility too faithfully. Judge Begoria paused for several seconds. She looked at Pedro, then turned to the government lawyer. Do you have any documents directly refuting this evidence? Barrio Nuevo stammered, We will need to verify. Begoria nodded. Then verify. Because from now on, we will no longer treat this case as if Pedro Vargas is a trespasser. In the courtroom, no one spoke. But every eye had changed. No longer was Pedro seen as a poor man defending himself. He was now recognized. A silent nod passed through the room, unspoken, but unanimous. Pedro returned to his seat. But before sitting down, he said one last line, a gentle hammer blow that landed like fate. I didn't come today to win. I came to remind you, we are not illiterate. We have simply never been heard with justice in your ears. Have you ever heard the saying? When a farmer learns to speak the language of the law, the whole system of power begins to tremble. In Santa Lorenza, that was becoming reality. After the explosive hearing, the atmosphere in the small town shifted dramatically. On the wall of the administrative building, chalk writings began to appear. Pedro isn't looking for land. He's looking for justice. Beneath it, a symbol, a gavel next to a stalk of wheat. Pedro had no idea this was happening. In his small house by the fields, he still rose at 4 a.m., lit the stove, read, and wrote. Only Tomasz, his son, who watched his father as though witnessing a quiet miracle unfold within their own family, seemed more awestruck with each passing day. That day, as Pedro was reorganizing his documents for the next session, Santiago, the law intern who had once visited, showed up unexpectedly. "Don Pedro," he said, excitement in his voice, "your case file is being shared among law students across the country. Some are using it as a case study. In Bogota, Chile, even in Argentina, they read talking about you like a teacher without a podium." Pedro looked up. A soft smile crossed his face. He asked simply, "So, what did they learn?" Santiago sat down and pulled a stack of printed papers from his bag, an academic analysis of Pedro's case from an international law professor. At the bottom, one bolded sentence read, "The Vargas case proves, the power of self-representation lies not in a degree, but in the ability to understand the essence of injustice." Pedro read it, then paused for a few seconds, murmuring as if to himself, "If from a small rural kitchen, a farmer can make the world rethink justice, then Clara would be smiling." That name made Santiago stop. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photo, an old image of Pedro as a young student, standing next to a girl with long hair, Clara. "This photo, you left it at the provincial library the day you submitted your supplemental documents. I kept it. Will you tell me who gave you the strength to keep going?" Pedro looked at the picture, then raised his gaze, his eyes brighter than ever. "It was someone who once said to me, 'If I can't stay and fight beside you, then fight for my part too.' And I promised. I promised with my whole life." That afternoon, Pedro decided to do something special. He went to the village elementary school and asked to speak to the 5th grade class. The principal, a bit surprised, agreed. In a small room, with 20 sunburned, muddy-footed children, Pedro stood before the blackboard. His voice didn't tremble but carried deep emotion. "Children, the law isn't something to fear. It's something to understand. And once you understand it, you must use it not to beat others, but to protect what's right." A child asked, "Are you a lawyer?" Pedro smiled. "No, I once wanted to be, but life didn't let me. Now I'm back not to get a diploma but to answer an unfinished question." The teacher wiped her tears. The children were quiet. They didn't fully understand, but they could feel it. That night, a new phrase appeared on the wall of the village library, painted in white. "Not all warriors ride horses. Some walk barefoot carrying memory and faith." And Pedro, back at home, sat at his wooden table and wrote in his notebook, "Today, I did not walk into a courtroom. I walked into the memory of my community. And if I have planted anything, it is not argument but the belief that even the smallest voice can rewrite history in its own handwriting." The next hearing at the Santa Lorenza court wasn't announced. It wasn't on the public schedule. It was labeled simply as a record review, according to the court clerk. Yet somehow, the news spread like wildfire. Hundreds arrived early that morning. From nearby villages, even those who had never set foot in a courtroom came streaming in. Pedro wore nothing unusual. The same white shirt, the same old hat, the same determined eyes. But this time, he brought 2 witnesses, an elderly farmer with a bent back, who had worked alongside Pedro's father since 1989, and a middle-aged woman who once served as the office clerk for the land registry more than 25 years ago. Government lawyer Barrio Nuevo looked visibly uneasy. He hadn't expected Pedro to go this far. And he certainly hadn't imagined the man he once mocked now held the one thing the entire system lacked, the integrity of memory. Judge Begoria opened the review session with calm but firm composure. She asked Pedro, "Mr. Vargas, why have you requested to summon old witnesses, when the case is currently in its technical review phase?" Pedro responded, slow but unwavering. "Because documents can be lost. Maps can be redrawn. Administrative decisions can be signed in error. But those who witnessed from the beginning, if they are still alive, carry a truth that was never edited." The courtroom stirred. Some nodded. And for the first time, a flicker of hope appeared in Judge Begoria's eyes that justice might be restored today, not through code, but through humanity. The old farmer took the stand. His hands trembled, but his voice remained firm. "I remember clearly. Back then, Amador Vargas was summoned to the township office. They assigned him the swampy land, no one else wanted it. But Amador said, 'I don't need to own it. I just need permission to plant seeds.' And then he plowed, he built a hut, and lived his entire life on that land." Barrio Nuevo interrupted. "But you don't have any documents to confirm this." Pedro turned, cold and steady. "If a man buries his father on that land, lives there all his life, and still needs papers to prove it, then we've reduced life to nothing more than a line item in a government bulletin." Next was the testimony of the former land office clerk. She presented a copy of an internal 1990 memo confirming the land was granted for indefinite cultivation, with Amador Vargas listed as manager. The courtroom froze. Even Barrio Nuevo bowed his head, flipping through his folder in vain, knowing there was nothing left to fight with. Judge Begoria sighed. And for the first time, she spoke not as a judge, but as a woman who had once known what it felt like to be cast aside by a system. "I don't care how far Mr. Vargas went in school, or what credentials he has. I know only this: this man is not just defending himself, he's speaking for a generation that can no longer raise its voice." With that, she postponed the verdict. But in everyone's heart, the decision was already made. Pedro stood. No raised fists, no tears. He simply bowed. A bow from a man who knew he didn't need to win to claim victory. Outside the courthouse, hundreds waited. When Pedro emerged, no one chanted. But dozens of hands reached out to shake his, to pat his shoulder, or simply to look at him, as if drawing strength. Pedro turned to Tomasz and whispered, "You see, son. I didn't plow the earth to plant seeds. I plowed through fear to sow faith again." Have you ever witnessed a trial where the witness wasn't just a person but memory itself? Leave the number 8 in the comments if you've ever felt that justice doesn't belong to the loudest voice but to the one brave enough to speak, even in a whisper. 3 days after the hearing lit up the sky like lightning on a stormy night, Santa Lorenzo was no longer a quiet town. People who once only bowed their heads in the fields now debated multi-generational land usage principles. Housewives whispered at the market about the internal 1990 memo. A tuk-tuk driver even hung a black and white photo of Amador Vargas beside an image of the Virgin Mary. Below it, a scrawled note read, "If we don't have papers, let our memories be the evidence." Pedro didn't laugh. He wasn't surprised. He knew this fight had moved beyond a piece of land. It had become a dialogue between truth and a system that once believed paperwork alone could control justice. But just then, the hands behind the curtain began to move. On the fourth night after the hearing, Pedro received an invitation to dialogue from a provincial official. Not in court. No lawyers. No press. Just a closed-door meeting behind the Land Commission building. The letter was polite. But Pedro, who had seen too many silent tears, knew what it meant. They didn't want dialogue. They wanted a deal. Tomasz looked at his father as he set the letter down. "Will you go?" Pedro nodded. "I don't fear proposals. I fear silence." So he went, not in hope of compromise, but to hear the truth of what they feared. The meeting lasted exactly 17 minutes. A man in a gray suit, identifying as a provincial advisor, got straight to the point. "We acknowledge you have a case. But you also understand if this precedent is recognized, dozens, even hundreds of similar cases could emerge. And then, we won't be able to contain it." Pedro looked at him. His eyes held no anger, only a single question. "If that scares you, have you ever considered that the reason these people don't have documents is because you never gave them any?" Silence. Pedro stood, his voice as firm as stone. "I didn't come here to be acknowledged. I came to remind you, any system that forgets to listen will, sooner or later, be corrected by the memory of its people." He left the room behind him, the hollow stares of those who once believed a fire could be extinguished by paperwork. Back home, Pedro said nothing. He folded the invitation and placed it in a drawer alongside Clara's last letter and the old hand-drawn map. Rain began to fall outside. But within him, another flame quietly burned, steady and unshakable. The fire of a man who had realized truth is never in a hurry, because it never retreats. That evening, Santiago the intern came running in, clutching a USB stick. "Don Pedro. They talked about you on national TV. There's a special report on your case. And a lawyer from the capital is offering to represent you pro bono." Pedro just smiled. "Thank you, son. But I don't need someone to speak for me. Because if I let someone else speak, they'll use the language of power. And I want to keep speaking in the voice of someone once dismissed as ignorant." He opened his notebook and wrote, "I don't ask them to bow their heads. I only ask them to look into my eyes and admit. We were wrong to think you wouldn't walk through the courthouse doors. We were wrong to think you were just a forgotten shadow in our files. But I am no longer a shadow. I am the light from the cracks in the system. And it cannot be closed again. Have you ever seen someone silent make the loudest sound?" Pedro Vargas didn't rally crowds, go on TV, or write a book. But he made an entire land and its legal system sit down and listen. The week after his closed-door meeting with provincial officials, something unprecedented happened in Santa Lorenza. Over 200 citizens gathered outside the courthouse. No one led them. No one told them to come. They brought photocopies of old documents, notebooks left by their parents, even photos of boundary markers that had been erased from official maps. And they said, "I'm like Pedro. I was told I had nothing, though I've lived here since before the roads were paved. I don't know the law, but I know the truth of this land." Judge Begoria stepped out of her chambers and into the square. She had never seen a spontaneous act carry such weight. No microphones. No banners. But every eye said the same thing. Today isn't just about Pedro. It's about the truth we all carry. At that same time, in a law school in the capital, a group of students organized a mock trial based on Pedro Vargas's case. What began as a class assignment became an open forum with nearly 300 attendees. Their professor said something that silenced the room. The purpose of studying law is not to win in court, but to stop the system from turning people into statistics. Pedro Vargas reminded us of that not through arguments, but through life itself. And Pedro? He knew none of this. That evening, he sat beneath the sapodilla tree in front of his home, rereading every old page. His eyes were dry but deep, as if each line had been etched into his soul long before this lifetime. Tomasz brought out a cup of tea and set it next to his father. "They're waiting for you in the square. They want you to speak." Pedro shook his head. "I don't need to say anything. They've already spoken for me. But people need a leader." Pedro set the cup down and said slowly, "The best leader is the one who knows how to stay still when everyone else is running. That's how people find their true direction." The next morning, Pedro arrived at court on time as always. But this time, no one smirked. No one mocked his worn clothes. Even the clerk who once called him that stubborn old man gave him a slight nod, a silent apology. Judge Begoria opened the session with an unexpected announcement. After a full review of the case file, the court finds not only procedural irregularities, but also clear, continuous multi-generational use of the disputed land. Therefore, the next hearing will no longer be a personal dispute trial, but a public hearing to establish a legal precedent regarding the right of memory-based ownership, a concept not written in any law book, but living in millions of people. The room fell silent. Pedro sat down. He didn't clap. He didn't speak. He just closed his eyes for a moment. Perhaps he was seeing Clara. Perhaps he was hearing his father's voice again. "You don't need to win, son. Just don't let them speak your truth for you." Santa Lorenza. Dawn of the historic hearing. No sirens. No international press. No armed security. But the air was heavy, like right before a great storm. A storm not meant to wash things away, but to uproot what had been buried. There wasn't a single empty seat. People packed in, eyes locked on the wooden desk where Pedro Vargas sat. Today, he wasn't alone. To his left, Tomasz, once just a boy behind a plow, now fluent in legal clauses. To his right, Santiago, the former intern, now the official court recorder for the case. And behind him, over 100 photocopies of similar family stories, people stripped of land because they had no papers, despite generations of presence. Judge Begoria began in a voice low, but firm. "This hearing is no longer about who is right or wrong, but about one question. Can a nation continue ignoring the legal existence of those it never formally documented?" Then she turned to Pedro. "Mr. Vargas, your final argument, please." Pedro stood. No folder. No prepared speech. Only memory, truth, and the pain of being forgotten. "I have no legal brief today. Only a message. If the court denies my family's rightful existence on that land, it is also declaring that being poor is illegal. That not knowing the law is illegal. That not being invited to sign a paper is illegal. And that dying on the land you cultivated with your hands is illegal too." The courtroom froze. No one had ever heard a farmer speak the law like this. No hatred. No bitterness. Just a truth so raw, it could not be denied. Pedro continued. "I can accept losing a piece of land. But I cannot accept that my children will believe their father was wrong. Because he didn't have a paper. Because the truth, Your Honor, doesn't live in filing cabinets. It lives in the hands that dug foundations, built homes, planted trees, raised children, and buried loved ones on that land. And if those acts aren't enough to be called ownership, then we live in a country that belongs to no one. Begoria bowed her head. A single tear fell onto her docket. Pedro didn't need applause. He simply returned to his seat, eyes closed as if in silent prayer. That afternoon, the national news broadcast aired a segment. A rural citizen successfully defended himself in court, not only regaining his land rights, but forcing the legal system to acknowledge a new chapter: the right to ownership based on generational memory. At 4:37 p.m., the official ruling was declared. The People's Court of Santa Lorenzo recognizes Mr. Pedro Vargas as the lawful heir to the disputed land, passed down from Mr. Amador Vargas. All prior rulings, evictions, and sanctions are hereby nullified. Furthermore, this ruling sets a precedent for rural land rights to be established through living evidence, communal memory, and uninterrupted contribution to society even in the absence of official documentation. The courtroom rose. But no one clapped. They cried. Tomasz embraced his father. Santiago stood in silent awe. Judge Begoria removed her glasses and wiped her face. And Pedro? He looked up to the ceiling of the courtroom and whispered in his heart, "Clara, I kept my promise. I didn't let them rewrite the truth about people like us. I didn't let them bury it with paperwork." That night, a white cloth was hung on Pedro's gate. Not to celebrate, but to honor the ones like Amador Vargas. Those who never got the chance to speak, but whose voices, thanks to Pedro, were finally heard. 3 days after the verdict in Pedro's favor, the silence did not return. Quite the opposite, the town awakened from a decades-long slumber. Families began pulling out old receipts, hand-drawn maps, photos of their fathers standing next to the homes they built by hand. Not to claim land but to claim recognition. Elders who once bowed to officials now stood tall in community meetings. Youth who once believed no one listens anyway now spoke into microphones, telling stories of their land, their ancestors, their right to be counted. Pedro remained unchanged. No interviews. No newspapers. When a reporter came to his home, he simply said, "I'm not a headline. I'm just a forgotten footnote finally returned to the right page." But even without speaking, others spoke for him. A local print shop began selling notebooks with the phrase, "Don't judge people by their papers. Read their lives." At the town library, the librarian opened a new reading section called "Memory is Evidence." Here, people could write down their land's origin stories even without any documents. In just 3 days, over 80 stories were submitted. On social media, the hashtag Pedro Vargas spread nationwide. Some called him the father of living land law. One post read, "It's been a long time since a verdict made the whole country nod not for logic, but for justice." But as with any rising tide, the wider it spreads, the closer it comes to resistance. In a private meeting between provincial leaders, one question surfaced. If the Pedro model is accepted, won't unresolved land disputes start pouring in? Can we withstand a wave of lawsuits? A young official, quiet until then, finally spoke. "They're not demanding. They're reminding us that we owe them an apology. And the longer we delay, the more interest that debt of trust will accrue." That night, Pedro sorted through his bookshelf. He pulled out the old wooden box, the one with the map, the handwritten notes, Clara's photo, and years of sleepless scribbles. Tomasz entered the room. "Dad, how long are you going to keep all this?" Pedro looked at him for a moment, then smiled. I'm not keeping it. Tomorrow I'm donating it to the community library. If I keep it, it's just memory. But if I share it becomes a seed. The next morning, people lined up to see the Vargas archive. As they began calling the exhibit of living evidence from a legal battle that rewrote Santa Lorenza's history, a child read aloud one of Pedro's handwritten quotes. "I didn't win because I spoke loud. I won because I remembered clearly." The teacher beside her quietly wiped away a tear. Because she knew those children would grow up no longer afraid to stand up for what's right. Have you ever heard the saying, "Justice may be blind, but truth is not"? Santa Lorenza was witnessing a phenomenon, a man with no degree, no title opening the eyes of an entire legal system with nothing but the truth he had lived. After the landmark ruling that recognized Pedro Vargas's land rights based on living memory and continuous contribution, many thought the story had ended. But in reality, it was only the opening chapter of a new era, one where the legal system was forced to re-examine itself. 3 weeks after the verdict, a special provincial meeting was convened. The agenda: policy review on land use for long-term residents lacking official documentation. The attendees weren't just officials. For the first time, farmers, village teachers, retired local staff were invited as community advisors. And on the list of speakers, one name stunned everyone: Pedro Vargas, representing the group Memory as Evidence. When Tomasz saw the invitation, he was speechless. "Dad, you're going to speak in front of the provincial leaders. Even the Director of Justice." Pedro folded the letter and placed it beside his worn notebook. "I'm not the one speaking. The truth is, I'm just the voice for all those who've been excluded from the table for years." On the day of the meeting, Pedro didn't take a private car. He rode an old public bus, shoulder to shoulder with 5 neighbors, people once erased from the land records, now walking beside him to reclaim dignity. The hall was packed. When Pedro stepped up to the podium, no one clapped, no photos were taken. But every back straightened. He began with a question. "How many of you here have lived on land without a title deed, but with childhood memories, funerals, weddings, and burials on that soil?" No one raised their hand. But many eyes dropped to their desks. He continued, "I'm not here asking for special treatment. I'm here to remind us all. The law should not be a fence that keeps the poor out. It should be a landmark that prevents people like us from being blown over by the winds of power." He held up 3 items. 1. A hand-drawn map from memory. 2. A water supply request letter from 1992 never answered. 3. A handwritten story by a student about his family, pinned on a classroom wall. This is our documentation. No color printing. No official stamps. But it's more real than any form you've signed without knowing the face behind it. The room was silent. The Director of Justice sighed and said, "Mr. Vargas, you've shown us something clear. We don't just lack laws, we lack listening." 1 week later, the Provincial Committee issued a temporary directive. All long-term, uncontested land use cases may now be reconsidered. Through community declarations, historical witnesses, and evidence of continuous living. It became known as the Vargas Regulation. No official wanted to name it that. But the people did, and no one could stop them. From that moment on, hundreds of invalid files began to be legitimized through trust and social verification. Pedro returned to his daily life. But now his home became a classroom where people came to learn law in the language of life. Under his porch, he hung a small wooden sign. Justice Remembrance School, free. No new shoes required. only a straight heart. Every afternoon, children sat on the ground, adults on low stools. And Pedro through his stories taught them that justice is not a privilege, but the result of persistence. One windy night, Pedro wrote in his notebook, "Today, a young farmer named Santiago asked me, 'How did you know you'd win?' I told him, I didn't. I just knew that if I didn't stand up, I'd erase myself from history. And the only real defeat is accepting that." Are you ready for the story to end in silence? Or will you help turn it into the first spark that lights a mountain? Tell your story. Because to someone out there, you might be the Pedro Vargas of a new era. Have you ever seen a hero doubted by the very crowd that once cheered him? Pedro Vargas, who opened a door to an unprecedented legal precedent, now faced a more elusive enemy than any courtroom: quiet jealousy from within the very community he had represented. After the Vargas regulation passed, applications for land recognition skyrocketed. People from neighboring regions flooded into Santa Lorenzo seeking guidance. And Pedro, with a wooden table, a pair of old reading glasses, and a thick notebook, became the unlicensed lawyer for every land-related grievance. At first, it was warm and hopeful. Dozens came each afternoon to learn how to write petitions, collect witnesses, and mark family boundaries from memory. Children sat at Pedro's feet, listening to his lessons about land rights like fairy tales. But then, the wind shifted. A man named Alfonso, once a friend of Pedro's father, submitted a claim for a hill near the old quarry. When it was denied due to lack of continuous proof and a known historical dispute, he began whispering that Pedro was only helping people he favored. At first, his words were just a pebble in a still pond. But then, the ripples spread. A few people murmured at the market, "Pedro's too famous now. You think he's helping people for free?" Another chimed in, "He helps some get their paperwork fast, others are left waiting. Is that fair?" Rumors don't need logic. They only need space, and Pedro's success accidentally cast a shadow that made others feel small. Tomasz noticed the change. One evening, he came home and said with concern, "Dad, should we pause the counseling sessions for now? People aren't looking at you the same way anymore." Pedro looked up from his notebook. "Son, light that shines long enough will eventually reveal the shadows. People don't want to see. But that doesn't mean we stop lighting the lamp." Then, one night, something happened. Someone spray painted the back wall of Pedro's house with messy black letters. "Not a saint. Stop acting like the law." Pedro wasn't angry. He simply cleaned the wall like wiping dust from a mirror of the heart. Tomasz, furious, wanted to call the police. Pedro placed a hand on his shoulder. "No need. If truth is so weak it can be erased by paint, then it was never truth to begin with. But if it's strong enough, every smear will only draw more eyes to it." Even so, the cracks had formed. Some people stopped attending Pedro's evening classes. A few former seekers now avoided him. And local news began running anonymous opinion pieces. Should Mr. Vargas still be the voice of the people if he was never formally elected? But in those headwind days, Pedro only grew brighter. He began reprinting old letters the government had once ignored, binding them as public records. He handwrote a list of those who benefited from the Vargas regulation and sent it to the provincial committee, calling for transparency, putting an end to rumors from the root. And he visited every home where doubt had taken root. Not to justify himself, but to apologize if he had unintentionally left anyone behind. When he knocked on Alfonso's door, The man opened with a hardened look. Pedro bowed deeply. I didn't come to explain. I came to say, if I helped someone and not you, perhaps it's because I wasn't strong enough. Not because you weren't worthy. And if I had the chance again, I would still choose to listen to everyone. Even the words of resentment. Alfonso stood silently. Finally, he stepped aside and said quietly, come in. I've got tea. That night, Pedro wrote in his notebook. When people grow envious, it's not because they hate you. It's because they're afraid of being left behind. And if you truly seek justice, then that justice must embrace even those who are angry with you. For they too were once wounded by the same injustice. If you were the one who lit the flame that guided your entire community, but then that very flame began to blind others, what would you do? Keep it burning, or quietly step back to avoid discomfort? Pedro Vargas now faced that very question. And this time, there was no clause in the law to guide him. Only his heart. In the days following his meeting with Alfonso, a strange stillness fell over the town. No more knocks on Pedro's door for legal advice. No more handwritten letters arriving at his home. No more respectful glances as he walked through the plaza. Some said Pedro should retire. He'd done something great, wasn't he that enough? Others whispered, if he keeps helping everyone and always stays at the center, isn't that just building a new kind of power? Tomas heard it all. But he didn't tell his father. He knew Pedro listened with his heart. And for him, every harsh word wasn't just sound. It was a cut, deep into his spirit. One night, Tomas came home late. At the familiar wooden table, he found his father writing in his old notebook for the first time in days. Pedro wrote, have I been standing so long in this place that I've taken away the chance for others to grow? Tomas sat beside him and gently asked, what are you going to do? Pedro looked up. For the first time, his eyes didn't carry their usual calm, but a quiet emptiness. As if the wounds caused by words had touched the deepest layers of his trust. I think it's time for others to speak. If I keep talking, other voices might start to see me as a wall, not a door. Tomas fell silent. He didn't want his father to be sad. But he also couldn't argue. Because he knew, sometimes courage isn't about standing firm, but knowing when to step aside. 3 days later, Pedro hosted a gathering on his porch. He called it, the ceremony of passing trust. He invited those who once sought his guidance. His students from the Justice Through Memory class. And even the ones who had criticized him. When everyone had arrived, Pedro stood. No notebook. No long speech. Just a few words. I never saw myself as a leader. I was just someone who walked ahead on a dark path and happened to flip the light on. But if that light has made you feel you no longer have the freedom to choose, then it's time for me to step away. Justice doesn't need heroes. It needs many people willing to step out from the shadows. No one spoke. No clapping. No resistance. But as the gathering ended, one small boy, once a student in Pedro's class, stayed behind and asked, so, you won't teach anymore? No one's going to read our petitions now. Pedro knelt, placing a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. I won't teach anymore, but I'm leaving all the books, the notes, the lessons and this table. Anyone who wants to carry it forward can sit here, and do the right thing. That night, Tomas found his father standing in the yard, gazing into the distance. toward the misty hills. "Are you sad, Dad?" Tomasz asked. Pedro shook his head. "No, I feel light. Because I know, stepping back in silence isn't giving up. It's a way to prove I was never the center of anything. Truth doesn't need a representative, it just needs someone to be the first to speak it. After that, it belongs to the community." Tomasz embraced his father tightly. For the first time, Pedro allowed a tear to fall. Not from sorrow, but from the peace of knowing his part was done. Since the day Pedro passed on the wooden table, the afternoon classes were no longer crowded. People still came, but they sat looking at one another. No one daring to sit in the chair where Pedro once sat. "I don't know where to start," a young woman who had once been his student said. "We're scared of getting it wrong," murmured a boy. And in that hesitation, another figure emerged. His name was Ruben Saenz, a former administrative clerk at City Hall, now retired. He opened a land consultation office right by the Central Market, announcing that he would continue Vargas's spirit but in a more professional way. At first, people were skeptical. But then, Ruben said the things people wanted to hear. "Don't stress yourself writing affidavits, I'll do it for you. Stamped and color printed. Only a small processing fee, 50,000 pesos. Much cheaper than hiring a lawyer." The people accustomed to free help began to waver. But without Pedro, and afraid of making mistakes, many chose the easier road. Within just 3 weeks, over 80 petitions were filed through the Saenz office. And curiously, they were approved extremely fast. Rumors spread. Saenz must have connections in the ministry. He's quick, efficient, not all those endless questions like Vargas used to ask. Those who once stood with Pedro began to feel uneasy. Tomasz, Pedro's son, confronted Ruben directly. "Why are you charging money for something my father did for free?" Ruben shrugged, smirking. "Free is nice, but it doesn't last. This society needs people who get things done, not dreamers." Tomasz clenched his fists, but said nothing more. That night, he told his father everything. Pedro was silent for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Were the people's petitions approved?" "Yes." "Were they forced to pay?" "No." "Then let them choose." "But son, some things get approved not because they're right, but because people decide to look the other way. And what gets passed by with closed eyes will eventually blind the one who looks away." He was right. Just 2 weeks later, a cross-agency audit revealed that many of Ruben's fast-track cases had used duplicated maps, fake boundary markers, and fabricated witnesses. Worse, some local officials had taken bribes. The scandal erupted. The press got involved. Ruben Saenz was summoned. But when reporters asked, "Where did you get this model?" he replied without hesitation, "From Mr. Pedro Vargas. He opened the path, I just expanded it." The whole town was shaken. A man once seen as a symbol was now being pulled into a whirlpool of suspicion, even though he had nothing to do with it. At the cafe near the market, people whispered, "So maybe Vargas was doing the same thing all along. What if there was something shady back then too? He just covered it better." Tomasz was furious. He confronted Ruben, demanding a retraction. But Ruben just said coolly, "If you want people to forget you, then disappear. But if you want to be remembered, you better be careful what legacy you leave behind." Pedro still said nothing. No defense. No statement. Until one day, Santiago, the former intern, came to visit and asked, "Do you think it's time to speak up? Because if you stay silent, they'll rewrite the story however they want." Pedro looked toward the yard. The late afternoon sun cast a glow on a newly painted wall, where someone had scrawled, "We learned to stand up, don't let others teach us to bow down." Pedro nodded. Maybe it is time to speak. Not to defend myself, but to remind the community. Justice isn't sold by the square meter. It's a process, not a service. That night, he went to the central plaza. To the same wooden table once placed under his porch. He stood up. No microphone. No written speech. Only one question echoed. Do you want to be helped? Or enlightened? Do you want papers? Or dignity? And one by one, people walked toward him again. No one told them to. But everyone knew. When the light goes out, people may lose their way. But if the one who lit the fire is still standing, then it's never too late to find your way back. After the scandal involving Rubin signs and the exposure of fake case files, public outrage erupted. The provincial committee immediately convened an emergency meeting to review the Vargas regulation, proposing a suspension of all land claims based on memory evidence, citing that it was too easily abused and lacked objectivity. On paper, it was a technical meeting. But everyone knew it was really a quiet trial of Pedro's legacy. Some newspapers didn't mince words. The retreat from a humane vision of justice. Pedro received an invitation not this time as a community representative, but as the individual responsible for initiating a mechanism now under scrutiny. Tomasz didn't want his father to go. You already stepped back, stayed silent, showed grace. Let someone else speak this time. Pedro smiled. Son, if I don't speak, they'll use my silence to say I've admitted guilt. That morning, the auditorium was packed. This time, not just local leaders but reporters, land policy researchers, and citizens who had benefited from the Vargas regulation attended. Pedro brought no documents, just his old notebook, the one where he had recorded every word, every session, every piece of hope. The moderator asked, "Mr. Pedro, do you have a statement?" He stood, still with that calm demeanor. But this time, his eyes weren't seeking recognition, they were passing on responsibility. I didn't come here to protect a name. I came to remind you that we cannot correct wrongdoing by erasing the good that has been done. Yes, some abused the system. Some filed fake claims. Greed crept in. But do you know why it could sneak in? Because we stopped at issuing documents. We didn't continue the journey of awakening ownership, not of land, but of self. He paused, then continued. I once said justice isn't a document, it's how we treat one another. Let me add. If humane justice isn't protected, it will be commercialized, priced, and sold. And when that happens, the poor, the ones who lived on the land with blood and tears, will be the first to be excluded again. The room went silent. A researcher responded. But sir, without documents or maps, how can we verify ownership? Pedro opened his notebook and held up a worn page. This is a water connection request from 1992 by an elderly woman named Herminia. No children, no title deed. She wrote, I've lived on my father's land since I was 14. I've built flood barriers each season, buried my neighbors with bare hands during epidemics. If that's not ownership, then tell me what is. She died in 1997. But because of this regulation, 25 years later, her granddaughter was allowed to stay without having to repurchase the very home their ancestors built from bamboo and mud. Pedro looked around the room. That is what I came to defend, not a policy, but the trust between people and the law. If we repeal this today, we won't just kill the Vargas regulation. We'll kill a rare flicker of hope this society once dared to ignite. No one applauded. But in the back corner, an old woman began to weep. After nearly 3 hours of debate, the committee decided not to abolish the regulation, but to tighten its processes, adding community education sessions, social verification teams, and independent field investigations. And the surprise. They invited Pedro to return this time, not as a representative, but as an honorary advisor. No salary. No title. Just trust. Pedro declined. I don't need to return. Because I never left. I only stepped back, to see who was brave enough to step forward. That night, in his diary, he wrote, "Some battles don't need swords. They only need someone brave enough not to stay silent when the right thing is called a nuisance. I've lived long enough to know. Silence is also a form of injury." 1 month after the historic meeting, Pedro did something no one expected. He removed the wooden table that once served as his justice pulpit from under his porch and placed it in the center of the town square, with a small wooden sign that read, "If you believe in justice, sit down and teach it to the next person. This is not my table. This is the table of memory." No one expected it to last a week because of sun, rain, or indifference. But something strange happened. The next day, a 16-year-old student named Mateo sat at the table. He read aloud Article 235 of the Civil Code, the same clause Pedro had once invoked in his first trial. A group of children gathered around, asking, "What does that mean?" And the boy replied, "It means if you truly live somewhere, love it, care for it like your own field, the law must listen to you." The next day, a young mother sat at the table. Then an old man who used to be a schoolteacher. Then someone Pedro had once advised, now returning to repay the kindness by passing it on. The table became a flame, quiet, but unwavering. Pedro never returned to sit at the table. He simply passed by each morning, looked at it quietly, and kept walking. Tomasz once asked, "Don't you feel sad seeing others sit where you used to?" Pedro smiled and replied, "When you teach someone to swim, you shouldn't cling to the edge forever. One day, you have to step back and see if they can float on their own." One morning, Pedro found a handwritten letter in his mailbox, no return address. "Thank you for not giving up when people turned away. Thank you for not growing angry when they doubted you. Thank you for proving ordinary people can redefine justice. With memory, patience, and a wooden table." At the bottom was a small line. "I sat at that table yesterday. And I didn't shake." That night, Pedro didn't write in his journal. He sat on the porch, looked up at the stars, and whispered, "Clara, they know how to stand up now. Can I rest?" There was no reply. Only a soft breeze, like a touch from the woman who had quietly walked beside him through this whole journey. On the last day of winter, with the morning fog still not lifted, the people of Santa Lorenza gathered for a small assembly. No officials. No invitations. Just neighbors. They called it the Day of Legal Memory, marking the first time Pedro had walked into court without a lawyer, without papers, with only the truth in his heart. On a small wooden stage, no speeches were read. A child took the microphone and said, Before, adults told us to be quiet. Today, I ask to speak. I don't want to live in a place where those who speak truth must bow their heads. Pedro taught me that. There was no applause. Only nods. Pedro stood at the edge of the crowd, wearing his hat, hands in his pockets. An elderly man recognized him and took his hand. "You don't have to say anything. We've already heard you. In the way we now live." Pedro smiled. And for the first time, he cried not from sorrow, but because he knew. Some stories, when they end, that's when they begin to live on in others. Thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share one thing this story taught you, and how it might shape the way you live. Your voice matters. Reading your reflections brings strength, healing, and inspiration to us all. If this story moved your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue creating stories that awaken the soul. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.